Dr. Merali, why should we all be more like toddlers?
It sounds counterintuitive because they often get a bad reputation and they have for many decades, but I really want to change that narrative. There's this kind of magical age between 1 and 5.
So I'm just curious if it's CEOs versus toddlers in a marshmallow challenge, who would most likely win?
Yeah.
Hi, welcome to Dad Life Blueprint. Today, I am joined by my guest, Dr. Hasan Merali. Dr. Merali is an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at McMaster University and a pediatric emergency medicine physician at McMaster Children's Hospital in Hamilton, Ontario. He received his medical degree from Harvard Medical School and Master of Public Health degree from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Merali is also the author of the book Sleep Well, Take Risks, Squish the Peas, Secrets from the Science of Toddlers for a Happier, More Successful Life. Dr. Merali, welcome.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
Nice to have you. So, Dr. Merali, why should we all be more like toddlers?
It sounds counterintuitive because they often get a bad reputation and they have for many decades, but I really want to change that narrative. Part of their time is tantrums. I'll acknowledge that, and maybe we can get that out of the way early on. Just to touch on that a bit, because that's the first question I usually get, is neurodevelopmentally normal kids, the majority of children, have on average one tantrum per day, and the median time is 3 minutes. So half of them are less, half of them are more than that. Very unusual to get to 10 to 15 minutes. It does happen. That's a full day. We look at these little kids. They're awake for 12, 13 hours a day. So let's say max, worst case scenario, 15 minutes of the day is in this tantrum mindset. But the rest of it is quite amazing. They're building relationships. They're learning. They're asking questions. They're laughing. They're helping other people. There is nobody better at working in a team, and we'll get to some of these things. But when you look at the adult wellness data, toddler behavior actually matches really, really well. And so that's why I think we should be more like toddlers.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, it's easy to, I've got a toddler at home and it's easy to fall into that mindset, really thinking about the hardest moments. But
Mhm.
I think you're totally right. I mean, most of it is joy and fun and laughter. And my wife and I try to remember to record funny. We have like a running list of things that our toddler says.
Nice.
Like someday we're going to want to look back at these moments that are so precious and remember this. So I just love that. And you mentioned, so you wrote a book all about toddlers. You mentioned in the book some of these attributes, and you just highlighted a couple of them just a moment ago. But can you talk more about the idea that toddlers are really giving? I found that really fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Hands down, I can say this after going through, and I put, a good 2 decades of research into this book and compiled it all together. And the first chapter after the kind of intro chapter is kindness, and I think it has the strongest data behind it. And I can say confidently that there's no other group of people that's more kind than this young child. And just to say a little bit more, I talk about toddlers and I use that a little bit generally. So I include preschoolers in that too. There's this kind of magical age between 1 and 5 of the things we're going to talk about, just so the audience is aware of that.
Yeah.
But kindness comes out in everything they do. And maybe we can talk about some specific ways they're kind. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your book, or maybe it was a TED Talk that I saw, a couple studies where there was one where I think they had a bowl of crackers and they were giving
Yes.
crackers to puppets
Yes.
and sharing, right? Is that?
Yeah, and the point of that study was fascinating. So the child is given some crackers, and they have a puppet friend. They're introduced to this friend. They're friends right away because they make friends with everybody faster than anyone. And there's an experimenter who's an adult, and the kids, as you know, it's a high value item like stickers, crackers, like those two things are the most important things in their lives. So that's like cash to them. And so they have their little bowl of crackers. The puppet has their bowl of crackers. Then the experimenter finds some crackers and gives it to the toddler, and they're asked to give those to the puppet. And then they're asked the toddler to give their own crackers, the ones that they have from the beginning, to the puppet. And they record their faces, and with that facial recognition, they're able to get a sense of their happiness and really score that objectively. And what you can see from that is that they're the most happy when they actually give their own treats to the puppet, not the things that are found. And so it really gets to why they're so kind is because it makes them feel so good. And it can make us feel so good if we learn from them and do a little bit more of what they do.
I love that. I found just the same thing. My wife and I give our toddler, oftentimes now she'll bring my wife is a nurse midwife, so she comes home sometimes with like treats that were in her break room. And now
Mhm.
our toddler in the habit of asking, did you bring a treat? And oftentimes she will try to bring a treat for him. And 9 times out of 10, he offers, she'll bring her two, Hershey Kisses or something, and he'll offer one to her, to
Mhm.
me, and try to share just naturally. And I think you're so right that it's just a natural tendency. And of course, we can all learn from that. And, wow, what a world if we were a little bit more kind in general and lived more like that. And in your book, you could outline other attributes. One of them is something that's really, really a passion of mine and important in my work and my career, which is the power of play. I'm a big believer that we can all use more play in our lives and that it leads to more successful outcomes throughout the lifespan. But I wonder if you can talk about that and some of the stuff that you mentioned in your book or some of your research around play.
Yeah. So first, I think that needs no research behind it. It's very, very obvious that little kids play more than adults. They do a lot of things a lot more. Like reading is another one, laughter is another one. But play is very obvious. They're injecting play into pretty much everything they do. My reference to the book of Squishing the Peas is that playful nature that they have, even when they're eating or even walking around. They're making little games for themselves, and so that is something they do really, really well. And when we look at that, and the way they're playing, and if adults could play more, there are some obvious benefits. So first, it decreases stress. What's interesting is that more playful people are also able to handle more stressful situations better. And then in the workplace, if we take play where we're really, really missing that playful spirit and the actual play in our adult workplaces, the most important thing is creativity. And I think that's incredibly important. And so my favorite study is a Swedish study. This is many different industries. Healthcare, engineering, you name it. Everybody has to have meetings, unfortunately. These are in-person meetings, and everyone's in this boardroom. They don't know the outcomes. There's someone else observing and doing everything else. Halfway through the meeting, half of the groups just get a bowl of chocolate and some fruit. The other half get just 5 playful items, like a stick-on mustache. There was like this little dart gun, this game where everyone had to just say hooray when someone touched their face. And they just let the meetings happen naturally. Those were the only changes they made. And then when they went back and analyzed what was said and done in this meeting, you saw that people were more open to ideas. They thought of more things. They were more collaborative. And it's such a powerful thing if we can harness that playful spirit that little kids it's just natural for them.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna steal that idea next time I'm in a role where I'm supervising a team.
Good.
When I've supervised teams, I've always tried to insert play when we've had team meetings in those ways where some sort of collaborative exercise in the beginning of a meeting, because I agree. I think it sets you up for being able to like have the openness to collaborate. And I love that one where it carries on throughout the meeting and
Mm-hmm.
makes it a little bit less serious, and like less serious in a sort of corporate boring kind of way, but
Yep.
but serious in a like that play is really work. It also reminds me, I worked at the Minnesota Children's Museum for a number of years, and we did a whole series called Successful People Play, where we interviewed different people. Al Franken was actually Senator Al Franken was one of our people that we highlighted, but we,
Interesting.
interviewed them about how they play, and it's just
Yeah.
just totally in line with what you're talking about.
Oh, I really love that.
And in your book, you mention toddlers doing a contest. You call it the Marshmallow Challenge, and
Mm.
they even compete against CEOs. So I'm just curious if it's CEOs versus toddlers in a Marshmallow Challenge, who would most likely win?
Yeah, so this is it's slightly older kids, kindergartners, but
Okay.
we're talking about the similar age range. And what they did is they gave different groups of people the same items, and the task was fairly straightforward: build the tallest tower. So you get 20 pieces of spaghetti, a yard of tape, a yard of string, and one marshmallow. And all of these people had to build this tallest towers. And the engineers and the architects did outperform everybody. We'll acknowledge that. But the kindergartners outperformed a huge number of adults. including CEOs. And so we're talking about, business school students, lawyers, almost all the other adults, because they're able to, like we were talking about, inject play, but also just think very differently. They're not stuck in these patterns that we have as adults. And not that those aren't important, they are, but they're just more open to new ideas and willing to try things over and over and over again, failing multiple times in this iterative process. And it doesn't affect them. They just like get back up when they're trying to learn to walk, and they just keep going. And this helps them learn faster than anyone. And, in something like this, actually do better than other people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so funny because I spend a lot of time in my work thinking about executive function skills, and it seemed like the hot topic in education circles now. And we're so focused on how do we teach kids these skills, but in a lot of ways, they already have a lot of these skills. And sometimes we weed those out through the experiences that we put kids through, right? I mean, that idea of
Yeah.
cognitive flexibility is really what you're describing there, where they can think outside the box a little bit and figure out ways that maybe we wouldn't think of because our adult brains have already filtered out all those thoughts, maybe
Yep.
experiences we've had in the past. So it's really fascinating because I think in some ways, yes, toddlers are learning those skills around patience and waiting, but in other ways, they're already way ahead of a lot of adults.
Yeah, and a lot of what comes back to us in different ways is living in the moment. And you probably heard this, and it's an important thing. And it's interesting if you have a very underdeveloped prefrontal cortex like toddlers do, and they're not thinking about the future. They are the ultimate people of living in the moment. They're so focused on what's happening here and now, and they notice all of these things. If you've ever had a walk with your little one, they're just checking out all of these things that you wouldn't notice: the clouds, the cracks on the sidewalk, any number of things. And so this way of looking at the world and then asking questions based on that, I think is very special and something we can learn from as well. Being curious and asking a lot of questions, and it gets us to a lot of information a lot quicker. And maybe we can talk about this more, but it's also a relationship building tool, and they use that in that way too.
Yeah, I love that. And, I think you talk a little bit about that in the book. And I found so much affinity with it myself because when I pick up I mean, he's a toddler, but he's a preschooler.
Hmm.
So he's on the upper end of the toddler, almost 4 years old. And I pick him up from school, and a lot of times we can walk to his school, and I have that exact experience when we're walking along, and he'll
Hmm.
oftentimes remember things that he often reverts back to, like when we were walking. We live in Minnesota, so there's a big chunk of time between like November till about now that it's so cold that we aren't walking. And so he reverts back to things he saw back in October. What he'll remember, like that house had a big skeleton. And so he's like
Yeah.
moving backwards in his brain to think about, okay, I remember this. And he's noticing the details, like you said, about, like that skeleton's not there, but I remember it. And they had that big spider, and like that, that web was there. And then right now they're talking about a lot about birds in his classroom. And the other day I would have walked right past it, but he was like, there's birds in that tree. And so we stopped and we looked at them and we talked about the birds, and he talked about related it to what he was learning. So just really fascinating to think about that.
Yeah, definitely. I have a 4-year-old, so I can relate. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's an amazing stage, and we have such great conversations about, especially wildlife. They love birds and animals, and they're another place where they really show their kindness. I don't think there's anyone more kind to animals as little kids are.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And you also talk a lot about, and you sort of mentioned this a little bit, but you talk a lot about the idea of toddlers and teamwork and mentorship. So I'm curious, what can professional, you kind of relate it to professional world too. And I love, by the way, before I finish asking my question, I love how the voice that you use in the book, oftentimes you're talking as if from the perspective of a group of toddlers in a workspace. And I think that's just so creative and so fascinating. And I was almost transported as I was reading the book into I was imagining these little toddlers walking around and operating in office spaces, which I thought was really interesting. So to get back to the question, I guess you talk a little bit about teamwork and mentorship, and I'm wondering what can professionals learn from toddlers about that idea of teamwork and mentorship?
Yeah, I'll start with teamwork. That, for me personally, it is my favorite chapter in the book, and it's
Well,
the first part of the second half. And the second half of the book, like you mentioned, is really a business book and we can learn so many things and we don't think about how wonderful they are. So teamwork, I think, is such a special one because they do things so differently. And again, if we look at the adult data, if we did things like this, our teams would be so much better. So my favorite studies are ones where toddlers are matched with an unfamiliar adult, so not their parent or anything, and they're given a joint task, something that requires both of them to do together. For example, there's like an elevator task where one person has to pull a string and goes up and the other person removes the ball. Something that you couldn't do by yourself, and they make sure that you're not able to. And so the toddler understands the task, the adult understands the task, they let them go, and then the adult just stops working and they look at them. And toddlers, it's interesting because what they really care about, they don't care if we get this ball. They care about that a little bit, but what they care about is the teamwork itself. And they're so hyper focused on that they make sure that the other person can work with them really well so that then they can work on the task together. And that's what they really care about. And so what they'll do is first, and I think this is really important, they just, without blame, without thinking that person, is inadequate in their abilities, they just address that person in their own way, like man or woman, whatever language they have. And then if that doesn't work, they tell them what to do, lift it, pull it. They just give them simple instructions.
Yeah.
Then they think that maybe that person doesn't know. So they walk over to that person and kind of show them what to do. It's possible that that person just didn't understand the instructions, and that's their mindset, is that maybe this person didn't understand. And then what I really love is that if they don't solve the problem because they make these toddlers unfortunately go through the process of not being able to do this thing, at the end of it, they use we. Like, we weren't able to do it. We didn't get it done. And they just go back to this team mentality, and there's no blame about these things. And I really love that mindset of just focusing on the team, focusing on the person being able to understand the task, and then making it a we outcome, whether it's a win or a loss, and not having that punitive language that sometimes we use.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. It's so fascinating, and I think having been somebody that over my career has been in roles, leadership roles, and then just sort of having followed a lot of the data around happiness in workplaces, so many
Hmm.
people, like, imagine if all like leaders and organizations or supervisors had that approach, right? Like, maybe this person just doesn't understand, maybe they just need some really simple, direct communication. So often, I have a habit of, kind of reading comments on LinkedIn or reading business books, and people talk about, from a worker perspective, frustrations with supervisors making a lot of assumptions. And, I love the idea of like toddler supervisors that would just operate from a sense of kindness, unassuming, really
Hmm.
just starting with like, hey, maybe this person just needs some direct communication, some direct
Yeah.
ideas about how to do this. Maybe they don't understand. Imagine how much happier people would be in
Hmm.
a lot of workspaces if leaders really operated in the same way that toddlers do in those spaces.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And another really big one, just looking at this idea, big picture,
Mhm.
is there's something called disadvantageous inequity. So there's some type of reward at work where we don't get what the other person got, and maybe we worked on the same thing, and that's
Yeah.
frustrating for us, and we will speak up most of the time for that. There are a lot of people who are marginalized and won't speak up. That's sad
Yeah.
and something we need to work on. But what's special about toddlers is they don't like advantageous inequity. So if they worked on a project with someone, and they got more than the other person, they will see that and protest that. They
Uh,
don't want more than the other person. They want that to be equal. And it just, I think, just goes to show their kindness and how special they are and how much better they work in teams than a lot of adults, and a really important lesson we can learn because we have so much pay inequity, other major social
yeah.
issues that we could address better if we were more like toddlers.
Yeah, I love that, especially particularly in our world now, just thinking from a equity lens and thinking about collaboration and shared outcomes and shared kind of um, shared success, right? And yeah, that's just lovely. And then you talked a little bit about mentorship as well.
Hmm.
You kind of touched on it in your example where they're using teamwork and then they're mentoring by modeling or giving direct instruction. Were there some more things on the mentorship side that, because you said this is one of your favorite areas in the book, right? So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to mention anything else around that.
Yeah, for sure. And then the mentorship is actually perfect for your podcast because I really relate it to caregivers and how they work with toddlers. And so we're talking about parents and we're talking about teachers and anyone who's in that caregiver role.
Yeah.
A lot of the book is about what toddlers can teach us, and this is kind of a little bit more of what the mainstream is of what how we interact with children.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things that parents do, that dads do, that are
Yeah.
really helpful for little ones. And we don't think of it as a mentorship relationship, and I don't think we should, but those things that we do as parents that are very positive, I think we can apply to the business world. And so some of those things are being able to choose the right thing to do. So we know our kids, we know their abilities, we know what they might be able to do. We know what they for sure probably can't do, maybe
Yeah.
developmentally. And
Yeah.
we might know things that are too easy for them. And so we don't need to like tell them to do those things. And so a mentor is really important in your own life because they can help you select the projects that's at the right level or a little bit harder for you. Because that sometimes when you're that person, it's hard to figure out what to choose next. And
Yeah.
so I like to relate it to that. Choosing the best project is one of the best roles of mentors. And then, secondly, and we'll get into this with self talk, but you know that toddlers are better than anyone at encouraging themselves. And the people around toddlers, just because of who they are and how they respond to feedback, like we encourage them more than anyone else in our lives. We're always cheering them on and clapping for them. And we should be doing that more with people we supervise or people we work with because there's such
Yeah.
a positive relationship and it instills confidence. And I love this toddler just walking by, in daycare or preschool, and there's always just clapping for each other and shouting hooray. And like that should be more in the workplace as well.
Yeah, I love that, and I do want to come back to the idea of self-talk in a moment, but a couple of thoughts percolated up while you were describing that. Just I think you're exactly right. I mean, the mission of Dad Life Blueprint is really about mentorship for dads, mentorship, community, relationships. I think so often, particularly dads or men, boys, we often in our society, especially American society, learn to sort of depress our social emotional
Mm-hmm.
capabilities and not show vulnerability and be tough and not ask for help, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one picture of what it means to, that's one picture of masculinity. It's one picture of fatherhood, being tough and being the provider and sort of, not ever asking for help and just sacrificing everything. Another model is a mentorship model, right? A relationship model, relational. I mean, I watch my wife interact with her friends who are also mothers in a very different way, and dads
Mm-hmm.
often don't have those communities, of relational communities where we can talk about fatherhood. Yeah, my toddler did this the other day. Like and it could be something that's a struggle, right? And I'm my hope with Dad Life Blueprint is to build those communities and to offer that relational connection for fathers. Um, Parents in general, mothers too, of course, can be
Mm-hmm.
listeners and enjoy this information, but I think particularly see a lack of it for fathers. So yeah,
Definitely, I do. There's a big lack of it. I'm so glad you're doing this, and I see more and more of it on LinkedIn because there's a big need for this.
yeah,
Yeah, it's wonderful that there are more people like you really focusing on dads because, yeah, that's not an area where a lot of people focus on. And there's so much, we know this from so many different studies. There's such a strong role for fathers, and it's so important for
yeah,
development and can help kids in so many different ways. And, I think when I think maybe this is the positive stereotype, I'll just say like dads are very encouraging people, I think. And that's one of the ways that we can really support our children as being that, really encouraging person at sports games or whatever they're doing and helping them along that way. And I think something that little kids look up to their dads for and something we can encourage fathers to do more.
yeah, definitely. And I think another thing that struck me as you were kind of describing the idea of cheering toddlers on, I also think about partnership, right? Like I think about it's hard work parenting, and I
Hmm.
feel like oftentimes in family dynamics, the partners put a lot of energy into the child or children, but then sometimes their relationship suffers and they're not cheering each other on, or it leads
Yeah.
to a conflict, right? Like the challenging times can lead to conflict. And so I know for my wife and I, we talk a lot about thinking about our relationship within the relationship of the family, right? And like
Hmm.
how do we not only model being loving, caring with each other, but also how do we make sure that we're proactively taking care of each other and cheering each other on, and providing support, whether it's I need to tag out right now, I can't, I'm about to, you know, lose it, or just really showing that support and modeling that for our little one. And I think that's really important for dads to know and for parents to know that can be an important piece of all
Yeah.
this of parenting, right? Is really taking care of your partner and taking care of yourself too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said a lot of important things. I think this modeling behavior, how we should be with our partners, is incredibly helpful for kids to see, and it makes a big impact on them. And then you also just, yeah, mentioned, and we should talk about that, is that parenting is hard, and parenting little kids is especially hard because it's so time consuming. We're not able to leave them to, like, take a school bus on their own even, or do much without them watching us as we're in the bathroom, because they just want to follow us around all the time. And so, yeah, I think dads really need to give themselves a break, especially when they have little kids, especially when they have multiple little kids
Mhm.
like yourself. And so it's a challenging time. For me, the mindset shift was, this might not be the most productive time in my career, and that's okay. And I am going to focus on her. Her name's Arya, and I love spending time with her. I'm just going to have those mornings with her and get there a little late when I can and get to her things. And I'm not going to have a lot of that time that I used to have focusing on career. And it's going to last a few years, and she'll be older eventually, and I'll have that time back. But that time is just, I think, especially going into fatherhood, you just have to know that that kind of continues while they're little for quite a number of years, not just the newborn period.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And that's one thing that a lot of our guests talk about, that idea of paternity leave. And I know that,
Hmm.
that's another kind of stereotype, and something that even the data shows, that a lot of fathers don't necessarily take paternity leave, and especially fathers that, so much of their identity is wrapped up in their career, right? And like,
Yep.
you're a medical doctor, like but you took paternity leave. Can you talk a little bit about that decision, and how that felt, and all that?
Yeah, yeah. So hands down, best decision I've ever made, and I will encourage all the dads, like, you will not regret any amount of time you can take. I'll say that it's so challenging for my American friends and colleagues
Yeah.
to do this. Like, the system that you guys work under makes it so difficult. And actually, it was one of the reasons I chose to move back to Canada, because I had lived in the US for so long, and I knew I was going to have a kid eventually. And so the paternity leave was a big driver. And so in our country and most other countries, we get 1 year off, and we're able to split that with spouses. And so my wife took the first 6 months, and I took the second 6 months, which admittedly was easier 6 months than the first ones. And so from age 6 months to 1 year, it was just the two of us at home. Mom's a speech pathologist, so she's in the hospital in person, has to be. And me and Arya were just hanging out and enjoying our lives. And it was actually the COVID year as well, the first year of COVID. So we were in lockdown too, and we didn't really have anyone to visit. So it was really just the two of us. And we really got to focus on each other and get to know each other, and develop that bond. And it's something so special. And, whatever time you're able to take, because it's so much more challenging in the US, it will not be something you regret. And it's something that will strengthen that bond. And yeah, highly encourage people to do that.
Yeah, I love that. And yes, you're right. I think in the US, it can be more challenging depending on the workplace you're in, the type of job you're in, hourly versus salary. These are all things that
Yep.
are often barriers in the US. But, I know that there's a lot of people out there doing advocacy work around this.
Good.
Actually, one of my future guests he worked at Google, and he blogged about his paternity leave, and he worked really hard within Google, even going to the higher ups at Google to try to advocate for paternity leave, and he really has become a paternity leave advocate in the US. But I know that there's a big movement right now in the UK as well. There's a group called Dad Shift, and they're out there testifying around paternity leave. So there's definitely a movement out there, for including dads in this. Oftentimes, I know in the U.S., many times moms will get maternity leave, but it's definitely less common to see paternity leave built into the to people's benefits. But one of the things that we're hoping to do at Dead Life Blueprint is also advocate for that, and um, perhaps encourage our listeners to be advocates, and then also perhaps work with businesses and around improving that, because it is so important.
Yeah, I know, and I'm glad. I'm looking forward to that guest. And I mean, doing it at some place like Google, that really is a retention thing. And then
Yeah.
businesses compete, hopefully, and more people adopt it. And this is how we're gonna make it happen. And yeah, it'll be amazing. I'm sure it will happen eventually.
Yeah.
Just like I'm sure eventually you'll have universal health care. But
Right.
these things will really change everything. So I'm excited about that for all dads.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned self-talk, so I want to get into that a little bit, because I think that
Hmm.
was a really poignant part of your book, and something that, again, I think oftentimes men, I think oftentimes have learned to kind of repress repress some of those things. Like, they maybe they're, I'm sure we're doing the self-talk, but we don't oftentimes reach out to friends or partners and find support when we're having self-talk that's not so positive. But you talk about
Yeah.
how toddlers use self-talk, and what we can learn from that in your book.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite topics, and I think it's so fascinating because not something we think about very much, and certainly we don't do it very much. Just as an aside, because I recently discovered this comedian called George Lewis, and I encourage your listeners to look this up.
All right.
There's a video, especially it's the most popular one he has, called Two Toddlers Chatting. This is what they're thinking when their father, and it's a wonderful father interaction, but without the dad there, about taking his nose and playing peekaboo. It is just unbelievably funny and wonderful, and it really gets to that toddler mindset of really what are they thinking when these things are happening.
Yeah.
So my example of self-talk, actually interesting. When I used to drop off Arya at daycare, I would just kind of be walking through the hallways, and it was fun because Julie. We live also in a cold climate, and Julie would put on her mittens and say, "Oh, I did it well," and she would just say that out loud, and nobody was around. And then I walked a little bit further, and I saw Colton, who was looking at his boots that were on the wrong way, and said, "Oh, Colton did it wrong." And again, nobody's around, and these little kids are just talking to themselves all of the time. And
Mhm.
it's something called private speech, and it's
Yeah.
out loud, and they do it for a lot of different reasons. Then kind of after age 5, 6, it goes away, and it gets kind of into our head. But then we're not really active about it. It's just kind of this chatter inside our head.
Yeah.
But if we actually use what toddlers do, we can actually use it to our advantage. And so, one of the most important things is that it's an incredible problem solving tool. And the way we do all of these things is we talk to ourselves in second or third person. So we don't talk about I. We have a lot more emotional reactivity when we use I. What if we talk to ourselves, Hasan or you? And then that way we can get to less emotional reactivity, and we can get to the problem solving part quicker. And I think maybe for dads, the most important piece when this comes in is this negative self-talk that we get into about perhaps our career when we're away from that and raising these little kids, or the way we're parenting, or something we got upset about. And we really get down on ourselves about that, and it's kind of this cycle, and sometimes it keeps us up at night too. But if we can change that, and I think one of the easiest ways to do that is talk to yourself like you're talking to your best friend, and just do that little frame shift can really help our own negative self-talk to get out of that cycle.
Yeah, I love that. Almost as a proactive kind of meditative activity, right? To be able to, like, really engage with that self-talk. And yeah, I think that's so important. And also, I think, really encourage fathers to talk to their partners too about their struggles. I mean, my wife and I kind of came into fatherhood in this strange way where, I had worked with kids and worked in education for years and years. And I'm actually a bonus dad to our toddler, and his biological dad has him for 50% of the time. So that was an interesting journey into parenthood. I came into his life when he was 2.5, and he's almost 4. So, the beauty of that was, like, so early on, like, he's got these early memories. of
Hmm.
me. And it's in his mind, I've always been around. He can't really
Yeah.
remember when I wasn't around. So I was able to quickly create that bond, but we talked a lot even early on in our relationship. My wife and I talked about all these things like how do we ensure that like we create that bond, since I wasn't able to do a paternity leave with him or like be there at his birth, all those kinds of things. Like how do we create that bond, that connection? How do we continue to build it, that love connection between him and I? And then we also were navigating the relationship with Finian's dad, and so that's a whole nother piece, right? Like blended families,
Hmm.
navigating other co-parents, that kind of thing. And it's been a really fascinating journey. And then as my wife and I talk about having other kids, we think a lot about how to navigate, one child leaving for periods of time, coming back in. So it's definitely complex, but I think we know that it's important to have those conversations and to continue to, as you said earlier, iterate because there's actually no blueprint, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's no guidebook or blueprint. All we can draw from is resources like your book or like this podcast or other parents as guideposts for how we might navigate this. And so one really solid foundation is your co-parent or your partner where you can have these conversations. Let's try this. Let's see how this works.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
now with us, with our little one, it's actually oftentimes the two of us having conversations and then inviting his biological dad into the conversation too, so that wherever he goes between his different spaces and his different transitions, we have some consistency and where he can see that we're all aligned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. And I love that you told me earlier about recording some of the things he was saying too.
Yeah.
And that can, yeah, just reminds me of a way how we can enjoy being dads. And I want that for all dads too. It's just so much fun, I think, to be around these little people and
Yeah.
whatever way that is. And they're really just people who love to laugh and they laugh easier than anyone else about little things. And I think that could be a tremendous source of joy for both people and bonding. So, yeah, highly encourage the toddler humor to come out all the time.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I do want to ask you a little bit more about kind of the impetus for the book, like what led to that based on like the work you do. But it just occurred to me to kind of launch into that. I wanted to share a story that I think you'll appreciate, and even thinking about that flexibility, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
being being flexible around plans. So actually this past Christmas, our little one was at his dad's and then we were going to get him Christmas morning and we were so excited to just have a beautiful Christmas morning. And my wife had worked an overnight the night before, so she was trying to sleep in until he was getting dropped off. And I had her phone just in case his dad called and texted to say he was on the way. And then all of a sudden the phone starts ringing and it's his dad. And I at first didn't pick up because I didn't want to throw him off by picking up her phone.
Hmm.
And but he called back again, and so I thought, okay, I'll text him and say, hey, this is Blake. I've got Laura's phone. Is everything okay? And all he said was, I think he needs to go to the ER. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna wake Laura up. So I go and wake her up and say, like, he's calling. Sounds like maybe there's something that happened. And so, come to find out that they were playing kind of roughhousing and they were playing in like a basket, like a laundry basket. He was kind of tossing him into the laundry basket. It's fun. And the laundry basket had a wire that had like come loose and
Hmm.
hit his Finian's chin. And so, Laura's in the medical field. So she asked some questions and it sounded like on the phone, maybe it was okay. As soon as he got dropped off, she looked at it and she was like, oh yeah, I think this needs stitches. And so we ended up we're in our Christmas pajamas.
Yeah.
We ended up all going together, all three of us with him to the emergent care. We sit in urgent care for a very long time. Finally, he's seen, and they recommend going to the emergency room because they don't think they can
Hmm.
do anything there. And so then it ended up being like 8 hours of time spent on Christmas Day in the emergency room
Yes.
in different spots. And, he was such a trooper. He was great. He was like really calm. In fact, we were kind of like, maybe if he had been like screaming, they would have seen him quicker. And we didn't go to children's hospital, which maybe we should have, because maybe we would have gotten seen earlier. But, that ended up being our Christmas. And we tried afterwards to look at the positives, which were that, unexpectedly he got to spend Christmas Day with all his parents, right? Like, and that's not something that we would have typically done with his dad, but we also got to bond in a way as co-parents of this child, and he got to see us all interacting in really positive ways, supporting him.
Yeah.
And so there was a beautiful outcome there. But so that's all to like lead into like, you work in the ER with children. I imagine you see really challenging things in that work. And so I'm just kind of curious to have you talk a little bit about that and what kind of led you to end up writing this book and be so fascinated with toddlers.
Yeah, for sure. I want to comment on your story because it's so wonderful in so many different ways. And I really applaud that father for playing with your little one too. With the laundry basket is such a great story. And unfortunately, what I see over time is us being more and more cautious with our kids
Yeah.
around minor injuries. And we get to this place where it takes away play that's so important, like we were talking about at the playground. And
Yeah.
I want to advocate as someone who is in the field of injury prevention as well, that I absolutely want kids to be in car seats. I absolutely want them to have the best pool safety. These are the things that are very serious and very dangerous. But when they're at the playground, when they're playing at home, most of their injuries are minor. It's okay. We can fix all of these things. We need to let kids be kids more. And yeah, we're getting a bit away from that. So I'm glad to hear that story. I have a lot of stories like that too that I see day to day, and this is what really inspired me. So I've been in pediatrics now 15 years, and all these little moments I've had with children, being kind, taking risks, getting all these fractures and cuts, which is a lot of what I do at this age, really inspired me about how wonderful these people are. And I just dug into the literature to learn more about them. I'm a researcher as well. And then, like I said earlier, just map this onto adult wellness data. And there's some things that don't match, but there's a lot that does. And that's what really inspired me to write this book, because they have so much to teach us. And we talk a little bit, we talk a lot about all the things we need to teach them, and that is true. But I really wanted to flip that script and talk about how wonderful these little people are, all the things they can teach us, and how great these interactions can be. Because for whatever reason, they get this bad reputation sometimes, like terrible twos, like it's such a horrible term, and I'm hoping to get rid of that. It's like not anything we would do for any other age group, and it's actually not true. And so this book is really about putting the data behind who are these people, how wonderful they are, in my mind, best people in society, and then what are the things we can take away from them, because there's a lot that they do right in their lives. And so that's was really the inspiration for the book, is really them, and dedicated to them and my now 4-year-old at the time toddler.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And I love what you're saying about risk taking too. And I totally agree. I know some countries are more kind of advanced in thinking about this idea of risk, and other countries are more cautious.
Hmm.
And also just like the idea of play too, right? I had an opportunity to go a number of years ago to visit Sweden, and I know in
Hmm.
Sweden they do a lot of play. And we went to this
Yep.
like place, and they had this pop-up play park, and it was all these families like out there playing on these games and stuff, and it was
Yeah.
cool. And even just the playgrounds were just like really fostered that idea of risk taking, challenge, climbing up to higher points than maybe
Yes.
we would allow kids in the US or even Canada,
Yep.
so I do think there's a lot of room for parents to not be so scared. And it also strikes me that while there, of course, are dangers out in the world, like I know when I talk to people about their childhoods, folks that are in our age range now, adults, a lot of people talk about the remembering the freedom of running around.
Yes.
Our parents didn't seem to know where we were. We just ran around, we rode our bikes, we took
Yep.
risks. And I think that's very different than how most children are being raised now in 2025. And so it's a challenge, right? Because while there are risks, of course, how can we tap into that magic that we often had as children in our own lives and create that environment for kids today?
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to, and I think of my own childhood too, is just the outdoor play,
Right.
especially, and the play in nature. And so I grew up in Northern Ontario, a very small town, 2,500 people, and just surrounded by a lot of lakes and
Yeah.
forests. And, was in Cubs and Scouts and did a lot of, yeah, time in tents and canoes. And I want to make that my daughter's world a lot, as much as we live in a bigger city now and you're in the Midwest, and at least we can have that accessible within an hour maybe or so, and
Yeah.
so we can get out on the nature trails. And I think that's where kids really get to realize their full potential. So if there's one activity that I think dads can do or families could do together, is really, that natural world exploration, which means hiking and canoeing,
Yeah.
things like that. And I think that really allows them to take the risks under supervision, but not, helicopter parenting.
Yeah, yeah. And I think even even people that maybe are it's a barrier to get out into the wilderness. I think even people that live in like really urban, environments, I think there are ways to still tap into that natural world, whether it's like because especially toddlers can like zoom into like really small things like
Yes.
an ant crossing or a bird landing on the sidewalk when you live in, a big city. So
Yeah.
just really encouraging people to tap into that. I think dads can really model that, and when they see their little ones focusing in on those little things, really create space and time to explore that.
Yeah, and a lot of these things are free, and it's a lot of
Yeah.
like parks and trails anywhere through
Yeah.
cities is, yeah, totally fine. They'll love it and learn a lot, and be able to, they'll find something to climb for sure.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So you so graciously before this interview shared a little bit about your own experience as a dad, and I want to ask you a little bit more about that and how your professional work and writing this book, how has that influenced the way that you are as a father, and maybe how have you learned, how has fatherhood influenced your
Yeah, it's been incredible, the journey. I'm very very fortunate that I get to work with little kids. So yeah, I think like we were talking about, like I just am able to see that a lot of kids are just naturally inclined to risk taking, and that we're able to fix most of those problems. So that just becomes more real with my work. And
Yeah.
I want her to have those experiences where she's allowed to take those risks. Even though I'm a dad that highly encourages that, I somehow got a little one who's more risk averse, but that's okay. We're working on that, and
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
trying to get her to do more. And yeah, I think it, as a doctor, the other way, this journey of fatherhood and having your own child and seeing them grow up has made me, I think, a more empathetic person when I see this other kid who's around the same age, or doesn't matter that much, but I just see her when I'm taking care of some of these kids, and I can understand what parents are going through a lot more, as scared as they are with minor and sometimes not minor issues that we have
Yeah.
to deal with. And so that, yeah, in some ways it adds to my job because I'm able to connect with those parents more. And I think it makes it more challenging because I get so much more deeply saddened by these experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine. And I can definitely relate, right? Where like my working with kids has really helped me, I think, be a better dad, but also having the parent experience, I think, helps me when I think about working with children. Like I can
Mm-hmm.
understand, I can be like you, I can be more empathetic to the parent side of things
Yeah.
and didn't necessarily have that experience before. And I also think like my wife and I talk about this a lot where playing into each other's strengths and I think one of the things for me is that I tend to be pretty even keel and calm in most situations in general, but I think particularly like the things that come up around our little one, I've seen before in classrooms, when I've worked with children, and oftentimes I
Hmm.
have like three or four things going on at a time. And so it's like, it doesn't phase me as much as her, where,
Yeah.
this is the primary little one in her life, and so I'm like,
Yeah.
this is just or like, I think sometimes parents, if your child's in a school setting, a preschool or a childcare setting, and you get feedback about something that happened that maybe isn't so positive, like maybe they hit somebody, or or maybe they're having trouble with potty training or something like that. I think it's really easy to like internalize that and think like, oh my gosh, my child is, you
Hmm.
know, not being successful here, having this struggle. And, I oftentimes remind my own wife, I'm like, well, we're only getting one piece. We only are hearing about our child. We're not hearing about the other kids in the class. I'm sure that everybody's has things that they're working on, right? And it's
Yeah.
not just particular to our child. And I think it's important for parents to keep that in mind as their kids grow up and as they get feedback from other adults that their kids interact with about things that maybe they're seeing. That it's not that we get little pieces of feedback that's really specific to our child, but we don't see the whole picture. And also, that feedback is an opportunity to really work with your kids on, whatever it is, like whether it's potty training or building skills around using words instead of hands, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I like that reframing. It is really an opportunity. And interestingly, I'm in the same situation because my wife works with the elderly population with swallowing disorders. And so, yeah, she doesn't have a lot of time with children except for her own. And so, yeah, it's that also, getting her to get used to, yeah, how little kids think. And the other thing I was just thinking about as you were talking about what's been really helpful being a dad is that I'm just able to relate to other little kids better. I'm in pediatrics. I like know a lot, of course, about kids and know what they're into. But now I can, talk about the details of Bluey. And
Yeah.
I can relate to parents about the struggles that my daughter goes through, like constipation
Yeah.
and the medicine that we need to do that and things we need to do about that. And so that's a nice relationship building tool as well.
I love that. I love that. Well, is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to kind of highlight from your book or your research that maybe like we didn't touch on? I know like the book is so fantastic, so I definitely encourage our readers to go out and get the book. We'll put a link down at the bottom of this podcast so you can find it, and a link to your website too, where you can get articles that you've written and find more of your talks and stuff. But is there anything that we haven't touched on that maybe you think is important to cover?
I think you mentioned the most important things, and I'll just say for busy dads, it's also available as an audiobook if that's easier for the commute times. And yeah, please check out the TEDx talk. It's 10 minutes long, and hopefully it's inspirational coming from your children. All children are wonderful. I focus on the little kids, but there are lessons we can learn from all ages. So no matter what ages your kids are, I just want people to just shift the mindset a little bit. It's not all one way where we need to. And I think parents and dads get a lot of pressure of like we need to be doing these things for our kids. And I think just flipping that a little bit, just being with them and figuring out what they're good at and how we can apply that to our lives is an important skill. And the hardest thing, and you had asked me a long time ago about dad fails, is just putting down the cell phone, putting away the cell phone. I learned that yeah, it's a really important thing we need to do to be present with our children.
Yeah, I love that. I was going to ask you, you sort of already answered it, but I was going to ask you just if there's any personal, I like to ask all my guests, is there any kind of personal advice that you'd give to dads? And you mentioned the cell phone. Is there anything else that if you could kind of give any kind of words of wisdom or things that you think dads should know? Anything in particular?
Yeah, I think really just not to be so hard on ourselves. It's a hard time not only parenting, especially if it's the first time parent.
Yeah.
It's a hard time because a lot of your time is taken up and just know again that they do take up a lot of time and that's a wonderful thing and that other parts of your life might not be as smooth as they used to be and that's okay and you need to give yourself a little bit of grace and have this positive self-talk that you can do this, you can be a great dad, you can still have your career. So there's a different time for different things, and the little kid phase is a challenging time, and it does get a little bit easier with a little bit more time freedom a little later on, and that's okay. And yeah, just be kind to yourself. Take that time for yourself, and with your partner. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's so critical. It's a really difficult time for couples as well when you have a small child or multiple little kids, and that again, that's that time suck that they have in a wonderful way takes away from other things that you need to focus on as well, like your relationship. So, hiring that babysitter, getting that date night in is incredibly important.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Merali, I so appreciate this conversation. You've given me a lot to think about. I hope that our listeners are getting a lot to think about. Please, please, please check out Dr. Merali's book. It's really an amazing read. We'll put a link down in the bottom of the podcast, and also highly encourage people to check out the TED Talk. We'll put that linked in the bottom as well, and Dr. Merali's website. And, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I hope that we continue to stay connected. I'd love to maybe have you back in the future as you continue your research and your work. Maybe you'll have another book out at that point. But definitely so much appreciate this conversation, and so much appreciate the way that you show up as a dad. So thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Blake. It was really great talking to you.